So this is from Exodus 33, verses 15 onwards. Then Moses said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you and I know you by name." Then Moses said, "Now show me your glory."
Awesome.
Amazing.
Thank you, Laura.
Okay,
So,
we're doing the talk together.
We are. We're doing dueling sermon. What was it like? I went to a bar once in America where they had dueling pianos. It's like two people playing at the same time. It's going to be like that.
It like sounds messy.
But the two of us.
Not at the same time.
Yeah, and that's really because our experience of unanswered prayer has been one that we journey together. And it's kind of almost impossible to separate our kind of joint journey in that. And it's kind of fair to say that our lives today are not where we thought our lives would be when we first got married and when we first met. And in a lot of ways, probably not what we hoped they would be or could have really understood at the time. And because the thing is, in the Christian world, people love answered prayers. They love miracles and they love those big stories, and people have written books on them and built ministries on them. But Lizzie and myself are the unanswered prayer people, and Lizzie has literally written a book on it. So we're the people you come to hear about when your prayers aren't answered, which is what we are talking about today. And it started before we got married. We met setting up a coffee shop in Chester, which was to connect with people who weren't Christians so they could find out about the Christian faith in a kind of safe environment. And around 10 months after opening, we ran out of money, both as a business and personally, and that had to close. And so actually, as we were heading into getting married, we had no money. We had nowhere to live at that point and no jobs. And the big kind of step of faith that we'd taken and we trusted God with just hadn't turned out. And, you know, we'd done a ton of praying. We literally had a prayer room in that coffee shop. Yeah. And despite all of the prayers, it closed.
Yeah. And it was a very public failure as well. But,
super public.
A lot of people that we knew struggled to work out what God was doing as well as ourselves. And then kind of like, this is then after that, we recovered and stuff like that. But one thing that has been very kind of prevalent in kind of my story, and something that you've had to work out how to support me in, has been like physical illness, and the stress coming out of the cafe meant that I had epilepsy and I lost my short-term memory. And so there were many days when I would have a fit and I wouldn't know where I was or what had happened. And a lot of my memory from when we first got married isn't there, which like
has its benefits.
It has its benefits.
All my mistakes forgotten.
And that was something that was just kind of working out, where is God in this? And then went on to have recurrent miscarriages. And we've actually in over the past few years, like in the early years of our marriage, I had 6 miscarriages, and we still don't have children today. And that's been a great source of kind of pain and understanding how to grieve and wrestling with God. And a lot of that happened when Dave was training to be a vicar. And so we were meant to technically, I think people see church leaders as being very spiritual and holy, which of course we are. I didn't feel very holy through a lot of that time, and really struggled with prayer and connecting with God. And throughout my life, there's been periods of time when I've had to give up work because of illness, with the epilepsy. I couldn't work with the miscarriages, the stress and the kind of physical toll it took on my body meant I had to stop working for a while as well. And then more recently, I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis a few years ago. And those of you who are in Story House Church a couple of years ago remember, like, I struggled to get out the stairs. I couldn't get dressed. I couldn't get out of bed by myself. And again, I had to stop working. And so that's been a very present reality of the physical limitations that can come with our bodies sometimes when they let us down. And whilst I know many people that have been healed physically, that isn't something that I have experienced in my life.
And we were praying a lot all the way through this. So to go back to that coffee shop that closed, like I said, we had a prayer room in it. We had people who prophesied that this wouldn't close when we knew we were starting to struggle financially. Said that, you know, God's not going to let that happen. We had, like, you know, again, incredibly holy, amazing, out there people for God, pray for it, and, you know, feel like it wasn't going to happen, and it did happen. And then when we went through the miscarriages, we prayed a lot that the pregnancies would be safe, and they ended up not being. When Lizzie's been ill, we have been to, you know, those Christian events and festivals, and we've been to the front to have people pray for us. We've had friends pray for us consistently. We've prayed for it. So there was no shortage of asking for these things to be healed or mended or made right. And we have seen some answered prayers, but not for these big things.
Yeah. And this isn't to say that we have a monopoly on suffering at all. Everyone's suffering consumes the space that in your life. And suffering in the Christian world is not about comparison. It's about kind of sharing our stories and walking with each other and sharing what God's doing and how we're surviving and thriving in the presence of God. And that's really what we want to do today, is to just come honestly and share some of our stories and how we've kind of got through it. And because really, regardless of the fact that our lives look nothing or very little like what we imagined, what we hoped for, what we longed for, whilst I would want to remove like some of the pain and whether physical or the grief, I would never want to go back to being the person I was before those things happen. I would rather be the person I am now, because of how the suffering that we've both gone through and I've gone through has changed me and changed us and our relationship. And I definitely am living in a place of greater freedom than I ever thought was possible because of having walked through this with God. So
it appears like through everything that we went through, God was up to something in not answering our prayers. There was something important going on there. And we would maybe go as far as to say that the unanswered prayers in our lives were more important than the answered prayers. So what is God doing when he doesn't answer our prayers, and what's going on there? Well, like Lizzie just said, you know, we're far from alone in this experience. If you walk with God for any amount of time, if you've prayed some prayers in real faith, then it's likely that you will have a back catalogue of both answered and unanswered prayers. And if you look at people in the Bible, if you read biographies of various Christians over the years, you will find that this is true, that there is both the celebration of the answered and the tension and the pain of the unanswered prayers. But unlike the answered prayers, which get a lot of publicity and a lot of attention.
And they are worth celebrating.
And they are worth celebrating, which is great. And we're not saying that's a bad thing. It's a good thing to celebrate those and make those public when it happens. No one likes to talk about the unanswered prayers. And actually, we have encountered people who are so unhappy and uncomfortable with the phrase unanswered prayer that they jump to resolve it quickly with all kinds of explanations. Now, some of these are theological and have little bits of truth in them, but others dangerously just shift into the blame game. They claim that the people praying or the person being prayed for doesn't have faith, or, you know, worse, they have unconfessed sin, or there's like a family curse or something like that. It swiftly falls into this very difficult and wrong-headed place. And in fact, there are entire denominations that have these kind of beliefs integrated into their theology. But here's the thing, is Jesus rejected that kind of explanation of unanswered prayers when his own disciples brought it up in front of him. And the thing is that Christianity, when you look at the Bible and you look at the intellectual history over the last 2,000 years, it is very comfortable with mystery, with gaps, and with tension. And what happens is when we have a theology that denies the experience of either answered or unanswered prayer, and there are some denominations, there are some Christians who can't cope with answered prayer either, kind of believing God's almost left us on our own. But when you deny either, you don't have the tools necessary to embrace reality as it happens, because the consistent experience of Christians over time is that you will have answered and you will have unanswered prayers. And the Christian answer to the unanswered prayers is no answer at all, or not the kind that we come up with. A few weeks ago, I was reading this book on Augustine, who was kind of one of the greatest theologians of all time. He lived in the 4th century in North Africa, and he's had just an enormous influence, not just on the church, but on Western thinking. And that's what I was reading about. But in this book, I came across his explanation of the source of evil in his famous book called The City of God. And he said that trying to find the source of evil, or the explanation for suffering, or the reason for an unanswered prayer, is like trying to see darkness or hear silence. It's like trying to see darkness or hear silence. But he goes on to say, we are familiar with darkness and silence, and we can only be aware of them by means of eyes and ears. But this is not by perception, but by absence of perception. And this really resonated with me and my experience. It made sense of a lot of things that we've been through, because every answer that has come our way around unanswered prayer as to why it happened or didn't happen felt incomplete or wrong, or on occasions actually quite hurtful. But what happens when we go through painful experiences, or we live with a situation that just isn't right, is we say, this can't be right. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. And that's the biblical response too. Because in the middle of the Bible, we've got this book called Psalms, which are like these songs and prayers to God. And around 2/3 or more of those prayers contain some element of lament. And lament is that complaint. It's that saying, this isn't right. And things that aren't right are not meant to be there. And if they're not meant to be there, then they don't have an explanation. They don't have an answer. And we make a terrible mistake when we come up with an explanation for something that God never designed into his good creation. In the same way, there is no explanation for vandalized art. And if we did give it an explanation, then we would have no motivation to restore it. To bring that down to earth a little bit, there's a guy called Rick Warren, who is known as the founding leader of a very large church in America. But he is also someone who lost his adult son to suicide. And I was listening to an interview with him last week just about this part of his life. And he had 2 great insights for people who have lived through suffering and unanswered prayer. And his first was that the greater the pain, the fewer the words. So if you come across somebody who has just stubbed their toe and they're swearing away, feel within your rights to tell them it's not the end of the world and that the pain is going to fade. But if you know someone who has truly had their world ended, what you will find is there are no words. There is nothing you can say. And the repeated experience of people is that you just need to sit with them. When we encounter things that aren't right, there is nothing we can say. And this is what happens in the book of Job. Job is arguably the oldest book in the Bible. It's certainly a very, very old book, an old story of this man who lost everything. He lost his health, he lost his family, he lost his business. He was completely ruined. And what happens at first is his friends do the right thing. They come and simply sit with him in his pain. But eventually they can't live with the tension anymore. And they start coming up with all kinds of different explanations for why it's happening to him. Many of them we've mentioned already. Many of them you may have unfortunately experienced as well, saying, he clearly did something wrong or didn't pray right. And this is God making things right again. But if people came up to you with those kind of explanations when there weren't words to say, how would you feel? How do you feel when you're hurting and someone tries to explain away what is happening to you? There are sometimes no words to say because it's not meant to be there and it isn't right. Rick Warren's second insight was that in the midst of their loss and their confusion and their pain, having an answer wouldn't have actually made things any better, but the presence of his friends did. So they are part of a small group, like we have a small group here at church where we know what's going on in one another's lives and we pray for each other. And so that group of people came around to the house and did that work of simply sitting with them in the pain, in the aftermath of the terrible event that had just happened. Now, if they had come like Job's friends with answers, that wouldn't have been comforting, but having those people near was what they needed. And this is what happened with Job as well. After his friends had let him down and he'd lost the comfort of their presence as they tried to give an answer, what happens to him next is this bewildering encounter with God. And in this encounter with God, he doesn't get an answer either, at least not the kind of answer that we would look for. But he does get this powerful experience of God. You know, God could perhaps give us an answer to that prayer that we've been praying, but like a scared animal, we might take the treat and run away with it, and he'd never see us again. And what God wants is for us to draw close. What he knows is that we need his presence more than we need his stuff. At first, when the miscarriages started to happen, they were just met with this stony silence. But not from God, but from me. I totally withdrew from God. I closed down my prayer life. I just stopped praying. But as the losses started to pile up, I started to open up. I started to lament. I started to complain at God that this wasn't right. I started to process my hurt and my feelings with God. And in time, that place that was so painful also became my place of intimacy with God. The pain of unanswered prayer was actually a kind of spiritual awakening for me. And eventually I grew to realize that I needed God's presence more than I needed an answer to my prayers.
And so, there was a time when we were living in Cambridge, when Dave was training to be a vicar, and it was like I was pregnant. It was the 6th pregnancy. And there is something that happens when you've been disappointed, is that it's very scary to hope again, because you're trying to protect your heart. And if you try not to hope too much, and you think it won't hurt as much if things go wrong. And there's a lot of anxiety, like for anyone who's experienced like recurrent miscarriage when you're pregnant. Again, every little feeling or twinge, you just think it's going to happen again. And so I was really on edge. And there was one night when I really thought that I'd started to miscarry. And so we contacted some friends and asked them to pray. And one of our friends got in touch, and she said that she'd been praying and that she really felt there were some verses in the Bible that spoke, that God wanted to kind of speak to me. And it was like some verses from Psalm 139. And Psalm 139, for anyone who struggled with infertility or miscarriage, actually is quite a painful psalm, because it talks about knitting you together in your mother's womb. And that can have some quite kind of painful connections. And I was looking at this psalm and I was just thinking, I really was hoping that actually the verses that she gave me would tell me that everything was going to be okay, and that actually that I would, the child be fine and the pregnancy would go full term. But the verses didn't say that. They talked about God's knowledge of me, that there's nowhere I can flee from his presence, that he understands everything about me. He knows when I sit and when I rise. And I kind of tried to sit with it and just think, what on earth are you trying to tell me in this moment? And I kind of wrote down in my journal, so this is my journal from the time, and journaling and writing prayers down can be a really, really helpful way to kind of connect with God, especially if you don't know what to say. You can just put your complaints down or just look back and see where God's been at work in your life. And so I wrote down, having looked at this psalm, it was saying, I think I've realized that God is most concerned with us relating to him, knowing him better, knowing his constant presence and perfect love for us, to know him as he knows us. And this in turn enables us to become the people he created us to become free in the knowledge of his love and constant presence in our lives. When praying for our sixth pregnancy, God spoke, but not always directly about the baby, but to me and about me. He wants me to know him and be free. Pregnancy and babies are amazing, but they cannot become a substitute for our own life with God. They will not become our calling or set us free from our insecurities and character flaws. We need to take responsibility for that ourselves. And it was just really that realization in that moment. And I think it's something I've continually been learning, is that actually the presence of God is what I've most needed in those times. And I feel really strange saying that, because when I think back to the person that I was when I was going through those times of pain and suffering, especially early days, I didn't think that would answer, that would kind of provide the solution and the healing that I was looking for. But what's really amazing is when you look at the passage that Laura read in Exodus of Moses, God had used Moses to lead Israel out of slavery. They'd spent time in the wilderness, and they were heading towards the promised land, this land that was called flowing with milk and honey, the land that they'd longed for. And it was something Moses had spent his whole life kind of building up to. And then God, in this conversation Moses has with God, like God's saying, like, you know, you're going to go to the promised land, but actually I'm not going to come with you, because, you know, you have been disobedient, and like I'm kind of done. And then Moses, in a very bold way, he turns to God and he's like, no, we need your presence to go with us. Otherwise, how will people know, you know, what sets us apart? And he was someone who had spent so much time with God, in God's presence. He'd gone up to the mountain and kind of written down on stone tablets the 10 commandments. He would come down and his face would be really shiny because he'd hung out with God. He knew what God's presence was like, and he knew that he wanted God's presence more than the promised land. And when you think about that, the question is really like, would we have responded like Moses? I know that there are times in my life when faced with loss, when I would have rather had the promised land, I'd have rather had the answer to prayer than God's presence. And yet Moses chooses presence over the promised land, because God says that he will go with his people, but that Moses won't see the promised land. But Moses was happy and willing to give up the experience of the promised land for the presence of God. I don't know how you would answer that. If you went to Sunday school, probably you know the answer is Jesus, but it's a really tough call. But that is something that I have learned in my life through walking through unanswered prayer, is that actually the presence of God trumps the answer to prayer. And that might sound strange. And there were basically, when I look back over different times of struggle, there were kind of two ways that I engaged with it. And early days, I didn't have the knowledge or the skills or the equipment, and I hadn't heard people in church really talk about how they dealt with unanswered prayer. And so when we experienced that in our lives, I just shut my heart down. I was very angry, and I became very, very cynical, because I would look at other people in church who were praying in faith, and I'd be like, well, you know, what is the point? They're just going to get their heart broken. The best thing is, don't expect too much. Just harden your heart, stay cut off, kind of protect portions of it, because the heartbreak was so great. And I lived like that for years, and prayer was one of the hardest, and it's been one of the longest journeys for me to kind of get back to praying with my whole heart, because when you've been disappointed, you try to protect yourself. But the thing is that what I realized during those times and during the miscarriages was that actually the more I sectioned off the heart, the more cynical I became, the more hardened I became, that actually I thought that that was a safer place to live, but it was not a place of freedom. It was not a place of joy, and it was not a place of fruitfulness. It meant that by limiting my prayers, it meant that I didn't connect with God. It was like being one of those Facebook friends that you're friends with, you know, when you're friends with someone from like years and years ago, but you don't message them or comment on their posts, you just watch them. And so you think you know what's going on in their life, but actually it's not a relationship. And that was like how I saw God, because I thought it was safer. But then what I realized over time was actually I wasn't kind of living a full life, that cutting my heart off, hardening it, being cynical, just wasn't a joyful place. It wasn't a fruitful place. And I had to just start to, open up and soften my heart, because it meant when I worshipped, I wasn't worshiping with my whole heart. I'd cut half of myself off. There wasn't joy in God's presence. And so when we went through a kind of second, I would say, season of suffering, when I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, we found out that Dave's salary would end from the Church of England. And so we had to kind of decide whether we would stay and go self-supporting. When we found out that we didn't know if we'd have a home, all of those things kind of happening at the same time, rather than shut myself off, I decided to go deeper into God. To seek his presence and keep going back to him, and kind of demanding that he help me get through this. And the experience of actually going deeper in, and the Psalms talk about this. There's often a journey of place, like going from different places that we see throughout the Bible, like Moses from slavery to wilderness to the promised land. You've got this journey from the pit to the shelter of God's wings, the shadow of his wings, that the psalmists kind of talk about a lot. And it's that declaration that actually the pit that I'm in does not have the final say, but I'm gonna move from that into God's presence, because he is the one that can get me through this, and calling out his promises and trusting that he would deliver me. And it completely changed how I engaged with my suffering, but it changed like how I endured it. And there was a peace and also a rest that is talked about so much in the Bible, about being led to the rock that is higher than I, that of resting in the shadow of God's wings. There is a rest that comes from going into his presence, because it is a presence of love, of deep love. And I can't remember what I was going to say next, but like basically that is the change. And that is something that I've had to learn. And it feels strange saying that, because it wasn't something that I thought I would ever see as the way to kind of survive this. But sometimes there is a sheer bloody mindedness to faith, of being determined that it will not destroy us. But the only way it will not destroy us is by going into God, rather than protecting ourselves and trying to kind of withdraw from him.
So something we found is that actually our unanswered prayer has been an invitation to engage with God more, to deepen the relationship, and actually to grow as people, to become emotionally healthy, and to increase our spiritual lives. And you know, that is what can happen in unanswered prayer. And if nothing else, that's the invitation we want to extend to you today as well. But there are all the other things going on when we pray that might mean, there is a reason why our prayers haven't been answered. And again, there's a long history of people who thought about this and wrote about this. And it'd be doing a disservice to say simply that's all that's going on in unanswered prayer, because sometimes there are other things going on. And to talk about that, I'm just going to take a little detour into a different type of prayer that I've had unanswered. And this involved a very difficult work colleague who was ruining the culture of where I worked, who was incompetent, incapable, and had bad character. And I knew if they just left, everyone's lives were going to get better. And so I prayed for it. I invited other people to pray for it, and it never happened. Now, I suspect that this falls into maybe a different category than the kinds of unanswered prayers that we've talked about so far, because there are sometimes reasons and things going on why we don't get an answer to our prayer. We have been following the prayer course, doing that midweeks and practicing it during the week. But there is a book that goes along with that course, How to Pray by Pete Greig, which is really good place to start if you want to learn how to pray. And within this, Pete kind of gives like 3 categories of the reasons that sometimes our prayers don't get answered. And they are God's world, God's war, and God's will. So we start with God's world. C.S. Lewis, yay, we made it. We finally got a C.S. Lewis quote in there. Got to. In his book, The Problem of Pain, where he deals with some of these issues, he argues that miracles by their very nature have to be the exception rather than the rule of our universe. And he puts it like this, that God can and does on occasions modify the behavior of matter and produce what we call miracles is part of the Christian faith. But the very conception of a common and therefore stable world demands that these occasions should be extremely rare. In other words, there are consistent, predictable consequences to our actions. We can know how the world works. In fact, it was this belief in God's provision of a stable world that gave birth to the scientific method in the West, which is a whole other topic, but worth bringing up. Whereas a world of miracles where God is changing things left, right, and center would be a world of chaos and unpredictability. And God's preferred method seems to be one of slow restoration. Jesus even goes as far to say that if God suddenly returned with his full rule, it would be bad news for more people than it would be good news for. And he is patiently waiting for people to return to him and to return to his way of living before he fully returns, in order that as many people as possible can be saved, can be part of his family, can be living well and part of the new creation that the Bible looks forward to. So that's God's world. Then there is God's war. So last week, when we were talking about praying for other people in situations, we said that God gives us the dignity of choice as to whether we will choose to pray or not. And whether we choose to pray or not will affect the outcome of what happens in the world. But what we didn't mention last week is that God also gives that dignity of choice to spiritual beings as well. So there's this encounter a guy called Daniel has, and you can read about it in Daniel chapter 10. So Daniel has been praying and fasting for a while without an answer, when suddenly this angel turns up, terrifying him and everyone else, as happens when angels turn up. And this angel says this incredible thing. First of all, that Daniel is respected in heaven, and so his prayer was heard, which is all kinds of awesome. Like we could do a whole sermon just on that. But more significantly for what we're talking about today, that this angel was delayed 21 days by someone called the Prince of Persia and the kings of Persia. These are spiritual beings connected with earthly realities. Now, you can read about the Persian Empire in history books, but we only get this tiny glimpse into the connected spiritual realities behind that same empire. For the most part, I believe God doesn't want to burden us with the knowledge of these things. But there's just a few times throughout the Bible where God clearly wants to make us aware that these things are there. And that when we pray into a sickness or political corruption or someone's addiction, there may well be connected spiritual realities, forces, and beings behind what's going on there. And if we're unaware of those things, we can be confused by what is happening. And what we do know for sure, that was for nearly a month, Daniel simply thought that his prayer was being unanswered and maybe even unheard. But what was actually happening was this angel was needing reinforcements from a more senior angel to overcome spiritual realities in the kingdoms in which Daniel was living, which is just crazy and insane to our minds. But all we need to be aware of is there are other things going on in this world than what we can see and pray for and are aware of.
We're going to be talking about God's war later on in prayer, with like this kind of idea of this warfare a prayer of like fighting with God. So that'll be a whole week. We're going to spend
got a week
couple of
coming
weeks' time
up on that stuff. So we've had God's world. He makes this world consistent. Miracles have to be the exception. We've got God's war, the spiritual realities that we don't see and mostly don't know about. And then finally, God's will. And for that, we're going to turn to one of the most wonderful verses in the Bible, but also one of the most misunderstood and misused. It's Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, those who he has called according to his plan. It's misused because it's often thrown out all too easily at those who are living in the tension of unanswered prayer, as if it promises there will be a neat end to your situation. Instead, what it's saying is that God, sorry, I lost my mouse there. So it's saying that God is weaving all of human history together according to his plan, which is good news for those who love God. All things, all of human history, not every little tiny thing. So that means it is perfectly possible for Christians who love God to have incredibly challenging lives, difficult circumstances, and for those very lives to be weaved into God's master plan. You know, the story of Joseph in Genesis is one of those stories where a lot of evil things happen to him, but by the end of his life, he finds out that these were actually meant for good, to save many lives, including his own family. To put it simply, God is dealing with the big picture, and we don't have the power, the mental capacity, or the vantage point or wisdom to comprehend what he is up to. But it does assure us that even our most painful moments are being woven into the great story of redemption. So I don't know for sure why that person ended up keeping their job with all of their character flaws and incompetencies. But it does feel to me like that was the kind of prayer where there was something else going on. I mean, for one person, for one reason, it violates their free will. We're asking God to forcibly remove someone from a situation, and perhaps they simply wanted to stay and God did not want to violate their free will. Perhaps God had bigger plans for them and me, you know, part of his plan. Perhaps there were spiritual realities even behind that I was unaware of. But whatever it was, what mattered in the end was that I trusted what God was up to. And the reason for even bringing up all of these other reasons why our prayers don't get answered is to learn a second vital lesson from Jesus, and that is the prayer of surrender. Because Jesus himself had at least two unanswered prayers. One, that the church would be united, which fails to be answered even today. And the second one was he prayed that he would not have to go to the cross and be crucified. And we can read that unanswered prayer in the Bible. But when we look at that prayer, we can learn how to pray in a way that helps us deal with unanswered prayer. So first of all, Jesus prays, Abba, Father. It's that intimacy that we're talking about today, that even in the midst of what he knows is coming up, but would still want to not happen, he refuses to withdraw from God. He is seeking God the Father. He's seeking that intimacy. Then he says, everything is possible for you. He acknowledges that God is sovereign. God can do anything he wants. He can make anything possible if he wants to make it possible. And it's quite common when we're faced with unanswered prayers to come up with the answer that either, or at least feel like God doesn't love us, or feel like God can't do that for some kind of reason. That is a common place that we can withdraw to. Jesus refuses both. He acknowledges that God loves him, God the Father loves him, and he acknowledges that God the Father is powerful and can do all things. Then he prays, take this cup from me. In other words, I don't want to die on the cross. It's poetic language for don't make me drink that suffering in. So Jesus, the Son of God, the perfect human being, in nature God, with the perfect prayers, the perfect life to model, can ask God for something that he kind of knows goes against what God the Father has been asking of him. We should be that honest too. Honest about how we feel, honest about how we want things to go. But he's able to do that because of the next line of the prayer. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Finally, Jesus surrenders. He trusts 100% his life to God. He trusts God's grand design and plan. As much as we want the world to change through our prayer, it may well be that it's us who changes through our prayer. I will never be able to have a satisfactory answer to why we went through all those pregnancy losses, those heartbeats we saw, the names we gave, those lives that were lost. And if anyone dared try to give me a satisfactory answer, I might resort to violence, just to warn you. But despite all of that, one of the things I have learned is to trust. You know, I'm small. I will live for 70 odd years on average. God is infinite and vast, and his wisdom is infinite and vast. And there are things going on in this world that I haven't got the faintest clue about. So much more for me to learn. And so the best stance that I can take is to stay close to God and to stay trusting in God.
So when we were chatting about like what we were going to talk about today, one of the images that came to mind was this image of a tree. And you've got, with a tree, you've got the roots kind of, you've got the branches and the fruit and the blossom that we can see at the moment. But then you've also got the roots, which you cannot see, which are hidden from sight, going deep into the soil. And obviously we all know the bigger and the older and the taller the tree, the deeper the roots, which means also the greater the fruit. We all have seasons of fruitfulness, and God has given them to us, and they're enjoyable, and we can celebrate the fruit that kind of comes with those seasons of life. But the thing is that sometimes when we are kind of in that fruitful season, we don't, I know I've done this anyway, like rely on God as much, because we're fairly self-sufficient, and it means maybe the roots, we're not kind of putting energy into where the roots are, going deeper into God, because we're relaxed and we're enjoying the fruit, and that is not bad. But the thing is that when the fruit dries up and the branches are bare and winter comes, because it does come, because it is an inevitable part of the human story on this earth, and it's something that is understood and accepted throughout the Bible, that this is when you have to dig deep in order to survive. For me, the most painful part of unanswered prayer was disappointment. I was so scared of getting hurt that I decided not to hope too much. And I believed if I kept my prayers limited, I wouldn't get hurt again. And so I sectioned off these parts of my heart so that I could manage God. And I thought this was the safest and best way for me to heal and survive. But it didn't. It made me numb. And the more I limited God's involvement in my life and my prayers, the heavier my soul felt. I thought I'd feel free. But the thing about using control to protect ourselves is that it's not fun or joyful. There's no freedom and there's very little fruit, because I wasn't thinking about going deeper. I was just trying to exist. But what I've been rediscovering over the past few years is that there is always more of God, and the life lived in partnership with him is just so wonderful. But unless we keep digging deeper into more of his presence and giving more of our heart to him, we will never experience this fullness that Jesus talked about during his time on earth. In Psalm 84, it begins by kind of saying about this longing for the presence of God. And it carries on to kind of say, blessed are those whose strength is in you, whose hearts are set on pilgrimage, on basically on it kind of going into the presence of God, because as they've passed through the valley of Baca, which is the valley of weeping, they make it a place of springs. The autumn rains also cover it with pools. They go from strength to strength till each person appears before God in Zion. The thing is that you cannot avoid heartbreak, but like the person talked about in this psalm, you can turn it into a place of springs and go from strength to strength, not by protecting your heart from God and limiting your prayers and hope, but by uncovering what your heart is most invested in. You see, if your longings are entirely focused on the fruit, on the bit of the tree that everybody can see, then life in the pit has the potential to completely destroy you. It's not that a fulfilling career or getting married or having a family or deep friendships, a safe home, are bad things to hope for. The danger comes when they are everything, because we've not invested in the roots. We're just thinking about the fruit. Throughout the Bible, God's people have wrestled with what their heart longs for. And those who have thrived in the pit have been those whose hearts were more desperate for God than comfort and a life that others looked at and were impressed by. And this is what we see in Moses' life as well. His desire for God was greater than the promised land of milk and honey. And one of the things for me is when I look at those two different times that I dealt with and kind of tried to endure through periods of unanswered prayer. The reason why I responded to God differently in this most recent season of suffering is because I believe it's because of the refining work God has done in my life through the experiences I had of recurrent miscarriage. Because during that time, he showed me that my longing to be a mother had consumed every part of me to the point when I had lost myself. And my identity, my vision of the promised land had become everything. And I could not imagine my life surviving the loss of that. But when he revealed that to me, I worked hard at rebuilding my identity on the rock that was higher than I. I fought to trust first in who God told me I was, of his promises that my life still had purpose and value, regardless of what it looked like to those around me. I worked on the roots. I dug deep to find value from something other than roles or achievements or fitting in, or like what others thought of me. So that when I got battered by those storms, I then was able to kind of not get destroyed. I rushed back under the shelter of my Father's arms. I sought his presence and I was not destroyed. Now, this was not pretty or straightforward. I still fought and cried and lamented and wished life was different, but I would do that and then I'd go run back into the presence. I'd put my energy, because there is so much energy in unanswered prayer. The disappointment brings with it this excess energy that you do not know what to do with. And for a long time, I was just very, very angry. But instead, I was channeling that anger, that energy, into making the roots deeper, in abiding in God's presence. Because we see from, like in John, Jesus talking about that's where the fruit, the lasting fruit, comes from, is when we abide in God's presence. And so the question really today is your soul consumed by the fruit others see, or are you working on the roots? Or to put it another way, what does your idea of the promised land look like? Does it include the presence of God? Jeremiah 29 says, it's this famous verse everyone uses. I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you. But a lot of people take it out of context. I know I've read that for many years thinking, well, God knows the plans that he has for me, but they're my plans, and that my plans of prospering, my idea of prospering, my idea of the promised land, my idea of fruit will be what God will bring into my life. But actually, when you look at the whole verses, it says, God says, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Then you will call on me, come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek with all your heart. So often our definition of what flourishing looks like centers around us. We have a vision of how God works and when he works, but these verses aren't about us. They're about God. Because it's all his doing. It is always God who takes the initiative. I know the plans I have for you. Then I will come. It's about God's decision to bless us, not because we've earned it, but because he loves us. And so really, and then when we look at that, the blessing and the fruit is always comes from being in God's presence, because of seeking God and seeking him with all our heart. So when you feel desperate, seek him more, go deeper. The fruit, the prosperity, the freedom will come. There's a tremendous privilege that comes with suffering. And it sounds strange to say that, but I am far freer than I was before. But it's because I had to go deeper first.